In this next lecture, we will talk about some other characteristics of monopolistically competitive markets. First, we're going to talk about what monopolistic competition does to overall social welfare. So, does monopolistic competition result in debt-weight loss? Can anything be done about this? Do we necessarily care? Next, we're going to talk about advertising. Some costs and benefits of advertising, why firms advertising, what economists have to say about it. So just to review from what we talked about before, monopolistically competitive markets in the short run look a lot like monopolists in terms of the graphs that we use. There's a downward sloping demand curve, downward sloping marginal revenue curve below the demand curve, and firms choose a quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Once they choose that quantity, they choose the price that they're going to charge based on the height of the demand curve at that quantity. And the profit or loss that they make is given by the difference between the demand curve at that quantity and the average total cost curve at that quantity. Demand is higher than average total cost, firms are making a profit. Demand is lower than average total cost, firms are making a loss. In the long run, in monopolistically competitive markets, the demand curve will shift and the marginal revenue curve that results from the demand curve will shift until we get a tangency between the demand curve and the average total cost curve at the quantity where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. That means that firms will produce at a quantity where they are making zero profits. This is because there's free entry and exit in monopolistically competitive markets. If firms are making a profit in the short run, more firms will enter, and that will shift the demand curve in. If firms are making a loss, some firms will exit, and that will shift each firm's demand curve that remains in the market out. So we have zero profits in the long run, just like in perfect competition, but each firm is producing less than it would have under perfect competition. You can see that by the excess capacity difference in the left. And firms are charging a higher price than they would have in perfect competition. And they're charging a markup over marginal cost. So let's talk a little bit more about this excess capacity. Well, so firms are small. They're not at that output level where average total cost is minimized. So why not produce more? Well, to produce more, the firm would have to lower its costs, to produce more, the firm would have to lower its price, and that would decrease its profits. So the profit maximizing output level for firms under monopolistic competition is less than it would be under perfect competition. So, and just to really hammer it home, perfectly competitive firms in the long run operate at quantity where average total cost is minimized, that point where you are at the lower point of the ATC curve where marginal cost is crossing it. Monopolistically competitive firms don't operate here. So, since there is this difference in quantity between monopolistically competitive firms and perfectly competitive firms, we could ask about whether there is any inefficiency. And indeed there is. So the firm could lower the price it charges and sell more, and at these additional levels, marginal costs would still be below the demand curve. So these would be, at least as far as society is concerned, overall welfare-inducing trades. So since our quantities are different here, we have deadweight loss. So the question is, could the government do anything? Well, not really, because our firms are already in the long run earning zero profits. So if the government tries to regulate this market, that would likely lead to negative profits, and you're not going to be able to get to a situation like perfect competition. So the other reason why governments may not want to get involved is the inefficiency here may be very, very small. Another reason that the government may not want to get involved is consumers may actually like monopolistic competition. So why is that? Well, we talked before about how in perfect competition, firms are selling the exact same output. So we have lower prices and higher quantities, and we have efficiency, but in perfect competition, we have no product variety. Monopolistic competition kind of have trade-off here. We have higher prices, we have lower quantities sold, and we have deadweight loss, but we have this differentiated products. And this is often known as a differentiated product positive externality. So there's this good thing that comes out of monopolistic competition that may make up for the higher prices and lower quantities and then some in perfect competition. So if we have more differentiated products, so that's going to lead to consumers being less price elastic. So they're going to have more brand loyalty. So that would lead to higher markups. And again, markup is the difference between marginal cost and price. And it's going to lead to more excess capacity and a higher price. Less differentiated products lead to the opposite. So we can kind of see this graphically. So we have two situations here, one with more product differentiation, one with less product differentiation. So we have identical average total cost curves here. With the more product differentiation, again, we have a less elastic demand curve. So we have a fairly steep demand curve. So here's the quantity that's going to be sold. This is the efficient quantity that would be sold under perfect competition. And here's our excess capacity. It's fairly substantial. If we have less product differentiation, here's the quantity that we would sold. Here is the efficient quantity. We have less excess capacity. So we get a market that looks a little bit more like perfect competition. Okay, so on to advertising. So advertising is a method of non-price competition. And it actually represents a large, surprisingly, amount of the annual economic activity in the United States. So there's a big debate over exactly why firms advertising. Some people think that it's only to provide information to consumers, let them know about your product so that they may choose to buy it. Other people say that the role for advertising is to try and differentiate your products so that you get that steeper, more inelastic demand curve and you make higher profits. Other people think that what you're trying to do with advertising is actually just shift the demand curve for your product out. So basically convince people who would not otherwise have bought your product that they should buy your product. So this is different than providing information to consumers. This is basically changing consumers' preferences. So how would this look like graphically? Well, here's the demand curve before I advertise. And then here's maybe my demand curve after I advertise. Notice that the demand curve has shifted out and it is steeper. So I've convinced more people to buy my product and people are less price elastic than they were before. So individual firms in perfect competition don't normally advertise. So since consumers don't notice differences between the products, there's really no point to advertising. But what you will see sometimes is that the industry can still benefit from advertising. So remember the campaign, Beef, It's What's for Dinner, the milk lobby advertises all the time, orange juice, those people will advertise all the time. Monopolistically competitive firms will also advertise a lot. So here, what firms are doing is, again, trying to affect their demand curve. So you see all sorts of advertisements for fast food and clothing stores. These are classic examples of monopolistic competition. So monopolies often don't advertise. Sometimes you'll see monopolistic industries advertise, so De Beers will advertise sometimes, but monopolies are the only game in town, so there's not as much competition, not as much reason to advertise. So why is advertising bad? Well, it does raise costs. And when all firms advertise, then it's kind of like a zero-sum game. You're going to, or an arms race, you're going to devote all of this money to advertising, and you're not really going to decrease, or you're not really going to increase your demand since everyone else is advertising. So if the firms could all agree to not advertise, then they would be better off. They wouldn't have the cost from advertising, then they'd have the exact same demand curves as they would if everyone advertised. So the other negative effect of advertising is if it does inspire brand loyalty, maybe where brand loyalty should not exist, then that creates more deadweight loss. So how do these increasing curves look graphically from advertising? Well, here could be a long run average total cost curve before advertising, and this is the quantity that I would sell at if I did not advertise. And here's my cost curve after I advertise. And now maybe this would be the quantity that I produce at after advertising. And notice that my overall costs have actually gone down, which is kind of interesting because my demand curve has shifted out. And however, if everyone else advertises, then I'm back to the same quantity that I was selling at before, but I have these increased costs from advertising. So basically what my industry has done is basically lowered everyone's profits. So you could think about advertisements again as being kind of manipulative instead of informative, and the government tries to manipulate this or to regulate this rather in some degree. So we have the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates advertising, and they're supposed to stop people from making not honest ads. So in our summary, in the long run, free entry and exit take economic profits to zero in monopolistically competitive markets. But there's still a deadweight loss in monopolistic competition in the long run because firms are still producing above minimum ATC at a lower quantity and at a higher price. However, this is possibly made up for and then some with this positive externality of product choice. So advertising, there's a big debate over advertising, exactly why firms advertise and how much consumers respond to advertising. So advertising can inform consumers about products. It can shift the demand curve for firms outward. However, it increases costs, and advertising can be misleading, which is not a good thing for society.